sing your praises.
So we are in Luke chapter 24, and we've been doing this study for over a year now, actually, here in the book of Luke, and about to wrap up the last segment of this. Before I get into this study this morning, though, let me share with you what I'm doing next. Because if I wait till the end of class, I'll run out of time and then I'll forget to share it with you. So bit of history, I guess, in some ways. I'll be the first to admit our new approach that we started a couple years ago. I guess now it feels at least been that. I guess maybe something like that, a year and a half or so, when we switched and we moved Bible study to the end instead of the beginning. It's got pros and cons, and if you sat any day of the week, you could sit down with me, and I'll throw more pros at you than cons, and the next day I'll throw more cons at you than pros. It just kind of the way it is. Anytime you're dealing with change, but I admit on the material side, and what I want to do with this time, I have struggled with, because it's shorter. Number one, there's not as much time. I feel like I repeat a lot when we're doing the same series, both Sunday morning and Wednesday night. I feel like because the audience may change from Sunday to Wednesday, and I feel like I'm always going back and telling you everything I said on Wednesday, and then coming back and saying everything on Wednesday that I said on Sunday, and anyway, so here's what I'm doing about that, and I've tried a couple of different things over the past year and a half or so. I have two different studies, so what we're going to do on Sundays is going to be different than what we're going to do on Wednesday. Now, where we're going on Wednesdays, I got a couple of ideas. I'll talk to you more about that on Wednesday. But here's what we're going to do on Sundays. So back on the back table back there, some of you saw it laying there when you walked in this morning, is a couple of sheets of paper, a printout back there. And that'll be back there every Sunday. And so there'll be a new one back there every Sunday. And the intent of it is for you to pick that up, and it is a daily thing. There's a thought and a couple of texts to read for today, and then there'll be another thought and some text to read for tomorrow, and Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday, and then when you come in on Sunday, that's our study. We'll look at those 7 things that those materials shared with you. So to me, that gets you engaged every day, gives you just a little something. You're not trying to just study on Wednesday to come in on Wednesday night and be ready to have a conversation. This gives you something to look at every day of the week. It's not lengthy. It wouldn't take you long to read the texts that are there. The material actually is adapted from some things that I stumbled across that I forgot I had, that Paul Rockwell had wrote. He had written, I'm guessing when he was at Pine Street over the years, he had written these booklets, and they were basically daily kind of readings, and I don't know whether, James, you ever saw any of those or not. You probably have a bunch of them. I think John maybe shared these, the ones that I have with me. And so I thought, perfect. It absolutely just kind of sets up exactly what we want to do. This particular one that I'm going to start, and I'm kind of starting in the middle, but I'll adapt that. It's fine. It won't hurt anything. And these are word studies, basically. And he picked a word or a thought for the month, and then he worked through every day and shared. So anyway, you'll see it as it unfolds. But that's what I'm going to do. So make sure you grab those. So when you leave today, grab that sheet that's back there, and it's dated. It'll say July 16th, July 17th, July 18th, July 19th, and what you're supposed to read and look at. Then when we come back in on next Sunday, that's our study. It's already in hand, and I put questions. That's something Paul did or didn't do sometimes with it, but I did. So there are questions at the end of the week. Then there are some questions you can answer. And what that does for me is this. Every week we're moving on. So if I only get 3 days worth in, you've already studied it. It was your personal daily Bible reading thing. I'm moving on. So we'll discuss what we can discuss, and we're moving on to the next one. And we'll discuss what we can discuss on Sunday, and we're moving on to the next one. So we're always moving on. So never come in thinking, well, he's going to pick up from day Thursday of 2 weeks ago because he's behind. It's going to happen. There are going to be days where we come in on a Sunday, and I won't be able to get through it all. And so it'll be what it is. We'll get through what we can, and then we're moving on, because it's not it's not really meant to be something where you're going to lose out if you don't have a discussion about it. It's for your personal Bible study. It's for you to take home and study with, and then it gives you an opportunity to talk about those things when we come in on Sundays. So that'll be the new approach. It's back there for this week. The readings actually start on Sunday because I wanted you to be able to start on Sunday, work through Saturday, and come in Sunday morning and be ready to have this Bible study time as it relates to it. So that's hopefully clear enough for you to understand what we're doing. So as long as you grab one of those, do the daily readings and the study, you'll be ready to come in on Sunday morning and have a discussion about those things. Let's go back into our text here in Luke chapter 24 for the last 15 minutes of our class this morning. So we've been working through this book, and we noted as we get to the end of chapter 24 here that Luke kind of paints the history with kind of a broad brush. He doesn't detail like the others may as it relates to the individuals that Jesus is specifically talking to at times, who asks certain questions, how certain contexts come up. He just kind of gives it to us. He just kind of gives us a few synopsis, kind of broad things that occur as it relates to Jesus. We know Luke did record, though, the one specific thing that he recorded that others didn't was that this road to Emmaus, right? He's the only one that talks about that. And this fellow by the name of Cleopas and this other fellow that was with him, and they travel into Emmaus. They didn't know who Jesus was. And while they're discussing, though they didn't know who he was, their heart what? Heart burned within them, right? The text says. And they knew something was different, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. When he broke bread and blessed it, their eyes were opened. And though they initially kind of were, well, the day is long, we better stop for the night, you shouldn't travel on. But then immediately when they realized it was him, he what? He vanishes, right? He's out of the picture. They immediately take off to go back to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's where we're at. They take off and head back to Jerusalem, and they're telling the disciples there in Jerusalem what they had experienced on this road to Emmaus and when they encountered Jesus. While they're having that conversation, verse 36, as they thus spoke, Jesus what? He's all of a sudden in the middle of them. Okay? And I see it that way. And as they thus spake, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said unto them, Peace be unto you. So, One minute they don't know who he is, the next minute they know who he is, but he disappears. They run down to Jerusalem. They're having a conversation with the disciples, and in the middle of that conversation, all of a sudden, there he is again, right there in the midst of them. And he says, Peace be unto you. What's their response? Verse 37. They're terrified, okay? Now, that's why I believe this is a miraculous moment where he's not there, then he's there. And the reason I say that is if he had been there all along, they're not, it doesn't frighten them, okay? It doesn't terrify them. If he had just been there all along and they're having a conversation and he's been part of that the whole time, there's nothing frightening about that. There's nothing amazing or terrifying about it. The fact that they're talking about him and what they had experienced on the road to Emmaus and at Emmaus, and then all of a sudden, there he is right in the middle of them, I'd take a couple steps backwards too, right? They are terrified and affrighted to the point that they suppose what? Why? Okay, it might be that they knew he'd been crucified and that he died. Why else? Okay, that might be part, because the conversation is about the fact that Cleopas and others had seen Jesus alive, right? That's the conversation they're having. We saw him alive. He walked with us. He talked with us. We experienced him. But then he vanishes away, and now he reappears, and they're thinking and are terrified at the thought that maybe this is a ghost figure. This is a spirit. That's not uncommon, right, with them? When something happens out of the ordinary like that, what other moment can you remember where they thought Jesus was a ghost? Yeah, when he's walking on the water. If you remember when he's walking on the water to go to the boat, and they looked out and saw him walking on water, they were terrified in that moment too, because they assumed the only kind of thing that could walk on water was a spirit or a ghost. Anyway. Yeah, I appreciate that, Kim. They do have a lot to process. And you're trying not to fault them here, right? Were there some clues and information that they missed that should have helped them process? Absolutely. There were teachings and things Jesus would say, things that he would share with them where they should have been quickly able to resolve some of their questions and concerns. But one second somebody's not there and the next second they're there, you take a second, right? You step back and you try to figure out what just... Say it again, Jim. Sure. Yeah, and so have we seen a spirit? What are we seeing here? What's his response to that in verse 38? Yeah. Why are you troubled? And why do thoughts arise in your hearts? Why shouldn't this bother them? Because he told them. Okay? I think that's the most obvious and clear thing that we've got to appreciate here. The reason why they shouldn't have these reactions is if they had just grasped and understood in greater ways what he had already shared with them and told them about himself and what he was going to have to encounter and things that were going to occur, things wouldn't be quite as amazing and terrifying as they thought. It's interesting, right? Because let me go back to the illustration I shared with you a second ago. On another occasion when they thought he was a ghost, when he gets it close to the boat, what's he say to them when he's walking on water? You remember? Anybody remember what he said? Be not what? Yeah, be not afraid. It is I. Don't be afraid. It is I. And at the end of that narrative, when Peter tries to walk on water with him, has some success, then has to reach out and be saved, Jesus makes that statement, "O ye of little faith." And then Mark's record of that same piece of history says that Jesus' challenges with them was the fact that they had not learned the lesson of the loaves and fish. That they had not, from that point forward, and I think that that's kind of Jesus' implication. From that moment forward, when you start with how many fish? 5 loaves and 2 fish. All right. I had to ask you because I get them all turned around in my head too. So you got 5 loaves and 2 fish, and you're starting to serve the people, right? And there shouldn't be a 6th loaf, but there is, and you just keep passing it out, and you put them out in these pods of thousands of people, and then you put them in little groups, and the loaves never cease, and the fish never cease. And Jesus' implication with this, from the moment you saw that forward, you should never doubt anything ever again. And I think it's kind of right? Once you've witnessed that, what more do you need to witness to recognize that Jesus can do anything? And that's why he was at times disappointed in them, because he had evidenced who he was in strong enough ways that they should be able to draw the right conclusions. But that's kind of where he is here. Why are you troubled? I told you I was going to die. I told you on the 3rd day I'd be raised again. People have seen. Why do these thoughts arise in your hearts that, in particular, that I'm a what? That I'm a spirit. That this isn't a bodily resurrection, that all you're seeing is a spirit or a ghost-like figure of me. And how does he resolve that? Yeah. Behold my hands, my feet, that it is I myself. It's me. It's not a ghostly figure. It's not a figment. It's not an illusion of. It's the same body that was laid in that tomb, whose hands and feet were nailed to that cross. And he says, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as ye see me have. Now, again, Luke's kind of giving us the generic version. There was one man in particular that struggled with that. Who was that? Thomas, right? And partly Thomas's issue was, that other accounts record for us, was he wasn't there the first time. Apparently Jesus appeared. So when they tell him what they saw, he comes back and he wants proof. And Jesus says, come put your finger in the print, right? The nail print. So there are greater details to this history that Luke doesn't record. Luke just kind of gives us this basic historical narrative that they had questions to resolve about the legitimacy of whether this is a bodily resurrection or a spirit. And Jesus says, come handle me, see the wounds on my hands and feet, and draw the right conclusions about that. Go ahead, Bob.
At the time when Thomas doubted Jesus, the rest of them had their doubts. But yet, the door is locked. He appears in the midst of them. Now they have doubts whether or not that's Christ the Messiah. I have trouble making the two different connections.
Well, and again, I think that because we're thinking of it linear, I think we're trying to think of it in chronological order, and I don't think Luke's doing that. I think Luke's just giving us a generic piece of the history. You know what I mean? He's not trying to give us this happened in a certain time slot. He's given, if I'm understanding your question right, and Luke's just giving us thoughts as to things that happened, not necessarily in a linear timeline.
Would it almost have to be in a timeline that Thomas' doubting was before this?
If you were drawing a timeline, in some senses, yes, because of the nature of the gathering that Luke's describing here. But again, my point is, Luke isn't concerned about timeline. He's not trying to tell us things that happened in an order. He's just telling us things that happened. Just like you and I might tell a story, and we might interchange and flip-flop the order in which those events occurred, just in the nature of us telling the story. I just don't think Luke's trying to give us. All he's trying to tell us is there was a moment where his disciples were gathered together. Jesus appears in the midst of them, and they're saying it's a ghost, and he's giving us a generic response of what Jesus did in relationship to that question.
We don't know that Thomas is there or not. So if it's reversed, I can understand.
Yeah. And again, you'd have to line them all up, which I don't have time to do in 5 minutes. But you'd have to line them all up if you wanted to get a linear chronological kind of picture. None of them are going to give that to you with clarity, because I've always argued that John comes the closest to giving us a chronological order of events. You could even throw 1 Corinthians 15 into that mix slightly, but it doesn't necessarily give a lot of detail. It just tells you a couple of pieces of the puzzle. But again, I'm just trying to make sure, from my understanding, Luke's attempt here isn't trying to say this happened, then 30 seconds later this happened, then a minute later this happened, and then the next day this happened. And he's not concerned about that. All Luke's doing is saying these are the kinds of events and circumstances Jesus found himself in after his resurrection. And he's using that kind of approach in telling the story. So you can make comparisons and maybe be able to deduce in which moments anyway. You're getting a bigger picture here, more of a picture than you are a timeline.
And already made the testimony that he had seen Jesus in the life.
Right. And it can be
challenging, right? Because, I mean, if you look, and since we mentioned it, and we're only got a couple minutes left anyway, and I can come back to this Wednesday, and that's what I'm telling. See, I'm proving what I was telling you earlier about this class situation. But so go to 1 Corinthians 15 for a second, and when Paul's describing the resurrection, he says on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas. So that's Peter, right? He's got three names, sometimes references Simon, which Luke actually references, but it seems out of context when he does, because it doesn't fit the timeline in which he says it in. But because there's no reference to Peter, and then all of a sudden there's a reference to Peter, Simon, in Luke's record. But if you go back to the gospel accounts, we know the first person to see him was Mary Magdalene, right? So then apparently Peter, then the rest of the 12. But that's a strange description in itself, because we were already down to 11, because Judas. Right? Go ahead.
right. Yeah, and
The first time. So none of these writers seem to be focused on giving us a linear, chronological approach to the conversation. They're all just telling us things that happened, people that were involved, details and things that occurred. And even as Paul records here, he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12, then of 500 at once. The greater part remained to that day, Paul says. But then he says, after that, he was seen of James. Then of all, well, who are these guys back here in verse 5? Right? And my point is, none of the, they're not trying to give you a timeline. They're telling you events that occurred. And if you think of it in a timeline where, well, if you've already, why are you telling me? No, he's saying there was a moment where he was seen of the group, and then he was seen of some other people, then he was seen of the group again. But Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15 ultimately is what? Verse 8. That's Paul's point. Verse 8 is Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15. It is not, again, to give us a chronological order of the things that Jesus did. His point is in verse 8. He was seen of these people, then me, one born out of due season. That's how I became connected to the apostleship. That's what Paul's point is in 1 Corinthians 15. And I think sometimes if we can understand what point is trying to be made in a text, it'll help us understand why certain details were given in the manner in which they were. But I just in this idea of trying to create a timeline of what happens after the resurrection, there are better men than I that have been able to figure out exactly which moment occurred in what order, because it's hard when you look at all these texts. Okay. Lord willing, I'll come back. We didn't get anywhere. I'll come back Wednesday. I'll refresh it. We'll push the reset button, and we'll finish. My goal will be to finish Luke on Wednesday night. I'll announce Wednesday night what we're moving to for Wednesdays on Wednesday. But for next Sunday, those lesson sheets that I put back on the table. If you would, let's bow our heads together. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day you've blessed us with. Continue to strengthen us as we strive to understand your testimony and word. We're again so humbled by the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Thank you for the power of that message. Strengthen us as we leave today. Guide us and direct us. And we pray this through Christ's name. Amen.